Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Dalick and me, Israel Smith. All right, Matt, thanks for joining me again tonight. And we are here sitting on my front porch again. Another beautiful summer night here. So we get a little caught up. We were just saying we had a little kind of a break with getting busy with summer and things, and Matt got to, you were one of the announcers for the Mokena's 4th of July parade this year.
Yeah, right? It was indeed for the first time. Yeah.
Wow. What was that experience like?
It was pretty cool. Yeah. It was, it went by in a flash. It didn't feel like it was an hour and a half or hour and 40 minutes, however long the parade is. But yeah, it was pretty cool. I was really, really flattered that the chamber asked me to do it.
Yeah, it's very cool. And any favorites? Anything that stuck out to you?
Yeah,
because were you a judge too? Did you get to judge?
I did not judge.
Okay,
unfortunately, I would have loved to have done it because I've done it before and it's really fun. But I did not judge this year. But there were some standouts. I really liked Curtain Call Theater because especially the kids, they came and sang for us right when the parade started. That was really cool.
Which my son was a part of. He was part of the Beauty and the Beast Junior camp this summer and loved it. And it was a great production. So I'm glad you enjoyed them too. That was good.
Yeah, I love Curtain Call. Curtain Call's great.
Yeah.
And they, I think it was one of the churches. It might have been Grace Fellowship. I think it was Grace Fellowship. Did a really cool float of a Little Mermaid theme, which I think is for their vacation Bible school they're doing this summer, but that was really cool. They went all out.
Wow.
And that float must have taken a lot of work to make.
It seems like some of the most creative ones are those, the church ones for the the vacation Bible schools. And they really do a good job.
You can usually count on the churches to really.
Yeah. And the bands are always great. The marching bands were really, really interesting, really exciting this year. Fun to watch.
Yeah, they were really great.
And then, so also with your blog, before we get into our episode today, which is a really interesting article on.
Thank you.
The Mokena Jailbreak of 1909.
Oh yeah.
But you did a 4-part series on the Semler family.
I did. Yeah.
Which was really, really interesting. And you want to tell us a little bit, kind of tell people why they're so important to Mokena and maybe a little bit about what you talk about over those 4 parts?
Sure, yeah. The Semlers, for those who are not familiar with them, was a family. Bill Semler, William Semler, was the patriarch. His wife, Margaret Semler, and their 2 daughters, Adeline and Ada. They lived in the end of the 1800s, into the 1900s. Mrs. Semler lived to be almost 100 years old. She died around, it must have been about 1988. And both of the daughters are also deceased now, unfortunately. But they were the proprietors of Mokena's village newspaper, the Mokena News Bulletin, from 1919 until it must have been about 1958 or so when they sold the paper to a publisher based in Lamont who kept it going for a little while. But the paper was a huge force for good in this community. Probably the most influential thing they did of many was finally using their political clout, if you can call it that, to get Wolf Road concreted for the first time, which was actually, it's a very long story. I go over it a little bit in the blog piece. It was a very politically charged affair, that whole thing. But by the time all was said and done, it was the 1930s, and that was the first real quality hard road that Mokena had.
Wow. And directly related to their advocacy and their...
Pretty much, yeah. They didn't do it all themselves, but they kept it going. The News Bulletin kept it going. Mr. Semler kept it going, and that was the end result.
And were there any competing Mokena newspapers during his time?
Oh, good question. Not really. There weren't any other newspapers. In the 1930s, there was a newspaper that ran for a brief while called the Mokena Shopper. I believe it was called the Shopper. Didn't last too terribly long. It's kind of mysterious because nobody really remembers anything about it. To this day, I don't really know who was writing for it, who was publishing it, how many people were involved. I don't know if publish is even the right word because it was sort of very kind of homemade looking. Like you could tell it had all been put together on a typewriter and stuff like that, whereas the Semlers had printing presses and was like a real quality newspaper, which was kind of an uncommon thing for a town of Mokena's size for the whole time it ran.
We also know that the Semlers were big in the Walter Fisher murder and the trial and advocating on his behalf.
That's true, yeah.
Any other big things that stick out? Any big Mokena events that stick out that they would have covered?
Oh, just about everything that happened in this town between 1919 and the end of the 50s. Things like weddings, births, the obituaries that were in the news bulletin were always great because they were most of the time like a mini biography of the person.
Wow.
Which are great for historical research. Aside from that kind of stuff, they also covered property transactions.
Which, looking back now, are significant records that are probably preserved better than most.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's if I'm ever curious about something that happened in that time frame there, I just go, it's probably in the news bulletin. Let's go check.
And they have all of those at the Mokena. You're able to look at all those at the Mokena Library?
That is correct, yeah. Luckily, this is nothing short of just an absolute miracle. The papers were all microfilmed that must have been the 1980s. They were microfilmed and given to the Mokena Library. The Frankfurt Library also has a set. And there are a couple small gaps here and there where there are some papers missing, but for the most part, it's the complete run of the entire paper. Even from after the Semlers sold it, the paper, as I mentioned, was published by a Lamont publisher after Mrs. Semler sold it in the 50s. They kept it going until 1969. So the whole run from 1919 to 1969 is preserved at the library. And
that's incredible. That's
it is.
Great.
It's really cool, and it's been a foundation of historical research. If it wasn't for all the work the family did, the Semlers did, for all those years reporting on the news in Mokena and the surrounding communities, which they also had in the paper, we wouldn't know not even half of what we know about Mokena's past now today.
And how much do you think of what you've done, the books you've written, and that would you be able to do without the work that the Semlers did?
Right. I wouldn't have been able to do any of it. In fact, they've been so important to what I've done over the years that I dedicated my first book to them. Wow. My first Mokena book that came out in 2011.
And obviously, we're going to do an episode. Maybe it'll be more because obviously there's a lot of great information about the Semlers.
Yeah.
But is there any family that's left of the Semlers?
The only family member that's still around is William and Margaret Semler's grandson. His name is I can't believe I'm blanking on his first. This is embarrassing. Blanking on his first name. He's a Westland. His mother was Ada Semler, who married Mr. Westland. And I know as soon as I go home, his name will pop back into my head. I have met him, and he's still in town.
Wow.
As far as I know. I haven't seen him or talked to him in quite a long time. But yeah, he's the only one, and he never had children, so. Once he's gone, which is hopefully a very long time from now, the family line will be gone. So,
oh wow,
yeah.
And their home, the Semlers' home, was on Midland Road here, right between your home and mine here, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And then they built that house right after Bill and Margaret got married I think they got married in 1914. And then in 1944, during World War II, they built a much bigger house on First Street, just a few doors down from here. And that's where Mr. Westland lives today. So it's still in the family.
Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then real quick on one of the other things you wrote about was the blog article that came out on June 4th, The Birth of a Village and Mokena's Road to Incorporation, which, had to be a significant moment for the village for sure.
Sure, yeah.
Talk a little bit about what the significance of that was for us as a village.
Yeah, it was a big deal when it finally happened because it was a force that had been going on for at least 5 years before incorporation finally went through in 1880. There were attempts earlier in the 1870s to incorporate the village, but they were shot down at vote in referendum. And how it was they won over the naysayers to come into the camp of incorporation, I don't know exactly. But
any idea what the vote, like the numbers were?
Yeah, I think I have the one election that happened in 1875. I did have the numbers for that. I'm pretty sure they're in the post, but it was pretty lopsided. Are we talking
about a couple hundred people here, or at the time, or how many people were voting? Any idea, like a rough idea?
The numbers of each side were still below 100.
Oh, wow.
The town probably only had a few hundred people in it at the time. But then again, only males were voting. So that takes a lot out. It was a few hundred people.
And what changed would have been the most significant change for the village by incorporating?
The most significant thing that happened for the village was the fact that the village board was able to control the saloons in town and not the county. Because previous to incorporation, the county was the one who was issuing as they were called then, the dram shop licenses, which were like liquor licenses. Mm-hmm. And at the time, as the end of the Civil War in the 1870s started, there was a pretty strong, once again, what they would have called back then a temperance element in control of the county board. And the temperance movement were people who were anti-alcohol, and which is what years later gave us prohibition. And they were not a fan, of the fact that Mokena had about 8 saloons in it at the time.
Wow.
And they said 8 is too many. We're only giving licenses for 3. And that's basically what started this whole thing, this road to incorporation, so that the village could control this stuff and issue the licenses and not have the county putting people out of business, basically.
So these bars have played a significant role in our village since its start. Huh?
Yes, they definitely have. Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Well, it's very interesting. So, be sure to check those articles out. And as we said, very soon will be coming at least one episode, maybe not more, depending how much we can talk. On the assemblers, which I think will be a really, really interesting and important episode.
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
Us as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
For this week's episode, as we said, it is on your article that you posted on October 15th, 2021.
Wow.
And it's titled The Red Hot Escape, Mokena's 1909 Jailbreak.
Yeah.
And you got a nice picture of Zap Taco on the front here.
It's the central place of the story in that one.
And are we talking about the current location, or are we talking about where are we sitting at that time? Yeah,
in 1909, the building that currently houses Zap Tacos, or Hatch Hall, it's been known for so many years, was in the location where it is now. It was built in the 1890s, but not moved to where it is now until 1901. So yeah, as this story is happening, Hatch Hall was where it is now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And anything else that we tend to have a couple, and it's funny. People on Facebook had said how a lot of these stories make it sound like Mokena was a rough town, and there's a lot of negative images of back in that time.
Yeah.
For one, I think those are most of the times the interesting stories that stick out. And
absolutely.
As much as we cover the good stuff and the fun times and the homecomings, things like that. There were a number of incidents that tend to stick out, and this being one of them.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So you want to give a little overview before we get into the episode?
Yeah, it's the story of a burglary that took place in 1909, where a couple of guys, really young guys from the city, from Chicago, kind of breezed into town, and they broke into John Hatch's general store, which is where Zap Tacos is nowadays, and stole some stuff and wound up getting caught, and they were put into the village calaboose, or jail, as we would call it nowadays. A calaboose is kind of an antiquated term. It just means a little building where offenders are kind of locked up just overnight.
And that calaboose, as we talk about, but you show the picture of, is still in existence today.
It is, yeah. The calaboose, the Mokena calaboose, miraculously still exists, still stands, but it's not in Mokena. It's in Lockport, in the Will County Historical Society's Heritage Village, which is a really cool place where they have historic buildings that have been moved from all over the county.
Okay. I have not been there yet. Is there a plaque or anything there that says anything, or is it acknowledged that it was a Mokena building?
Yeah, I think I've been there quite a few times. I seem to remember there being a sign on it that says just Mokena Calaboose. There's not really like anything that goes into detail on the history of it, but of which there's a lot.
But we've covered it a couple times. It keeps coming up in the podcast here and there.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Too,
yeah.
So, good. Well, it's an interesting story, kind of, funny to look at back, and you'll hear it's not like they didn't rob the guy blind. It was fairly insignificant. But you see what happens to him afterwards. So with that, Matt, please, let's hear this article, The Red Hot Escape, Mokena's 1909 Jailbreak.
Our fair village is generally a peaceful place, as it always has been. However, if one knows just where to look, provocative cases of crime can be found in the pages of our history. While stories of malice and violence are hidden in certain places, most of the stories of lawbreaking in Mokena's long history are relatively small-time affairs. Nevertheless, in brittle newspaper clippings and long-forgotten memories, there is one tale of a treacherous burglary, followed by a daring jailbreak under the cover of darkness. Let us turn the hands of time back to 1909 and set the stage in John A. Hatch's General Store on Mokena Street. The shop was a one-stop location for the Mokenian of the early 20th century. From boots and shoes to groceries and even sewing supplies, Hatch had it all. One of the village's founding fathers and a much-respected citizen, on October 8th, 1909, he opened the store much as he did on any other morning. Inside, though, something was amiss. Sometime during the night, burglars had struck the store and plundered it of goods. After they climbed in through a window in his storeroom, Hatch figured out that the thieves had snatched 30 cents from a slot machine, as well as a hodgepodge of pipes, cigars, chewing gum, and combs. To his relief, the storekeeper's cash drawer was untouched. When word spread through tiny Mokena that Hatch had been looted, some townspeople remembered having seen a pair of strangers milling around some neighboring coal sheds. Those who saw them remembered that they were young men, 16 or 17 years old, more like boys. Their light-colored suits and tan shoes stuck out and were noticed by Mokenians. On the same day of the burglary, the two were arrested on suspicion of having been the thieves and gave their names as Edward Clark and William Rhodes of Chicago. An early report of the arrest pointed out that the duo were inveterate cigarette smokers. John Hatch was a man known in town for his gentle ways with area youngsters, and after the boys were taken into custody, was willing to go easy on them. It was his wish that if their parents could come to town and make good for his losses, he would not press any charges. In the meantime, the teens were locked up in the village calaboose by Constable Conrad Schenkel, Mokena's one-man police force. The jail was barely more than a small wooden shack furnished with a potbelly stove. As the autumn night descended over the village, the two youths felt a chill in the air. They mentioned to the German-born Schenkel that they were cold, and a warming fire was built for them inside the lockup. Long after Mokena was asleep, they then patiently heated a fire poker to a red-hot glow and used it to singe a wooden post upon which the shack's door hung. After diligently working, the door had been loosened enough for them to slip away into the darkness. That Thursday's issue of the Joliet Weekly News heralded the escape by screaming, "Use red-hot poker to gain liberty," from its headlines. The jailbreak was even said to have caused a mild sensation in the county seat. Back in Mokena, uncomfortable questions began to be raised to Constable Schenkel, namely as to his whereabouts that night and why he hadn't kept a better eye on the lockup. Firing back, he defended himself by proclaiming that there was never a poker in the calaboose to begin with. He suspected that some town boys may have slid it to the prisoners through a barred window without realizing the consequences. Schenkel phoned neighboring towns with the names and descriptions of the suspects, hoping to catch them before they got too far from Mokena. The officer's frustration with the entire situation only got worse when he followed up on the city addresses given to him by his arrestees, as they turned out to be fake, along with their names. His vexation reached a peak 2 weeks later when he took a phone call from Orland. Schenkel learned that a similar burglary had taken place there, and that two males were in custody whose looks matched that of the boys. Upon their presentation to him, he was bowled over to see that these were not the two he was looking for. To add insult to injury, in the last days of October, Schenkel received what was mildly called a comic postcard with a Chicago postmark referencing the whole episode, and some were of the opinion that it was from his fugitives. Luckily for Conrad Schenkel, he received word from authorities in the city that a Pinkerton detective had caught his suspects, whose real names turned out to be William Reel and Edwin Scott. They were shipped back to Mokena in handcuffs on November 5th, where they stood trial by Magistrate Willard Owen. They admitted their guilt under little pressure. Before long, they were sent to Joliet to withstand sentencing by the grand jury. While there, their jailer made a comment to the Weekly News in which he cracked that any fire pokers would be kept on the opposite side of the bars from them. In the end, William Reel and Edwin Scott were given 100 days in the county jail for their theft of Hatch's store. The juxtaposition of the two city boys and their crime against then rural Mokena was greatly enjoyed by the day's media. The news editorialized that the temptations and pitfalls presented by the city of Chicago were ultimately responsible for Reel and Scott's immoral act. So it was that they earned their place in our community's history, a footnote among other stories of love, friendship, and memories. While some may not be fond of reminiscence of tales like this one, a full understanding of our illustrious history cannot be had without them.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. I like the humor at the end where they said they're going to keep the pokers away from them. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, everybody thought it was hilarious when it happened.
And was that more of a joke on Mokena, do you think? A prod at Mokena, or just a general humor, maybe?
I kind of think it was. Of course, I could be wrong because I wasn't there, et cetera, but in looking at the reportage that appeared in the Joliet papers over this whole incident, it kind of sounds like they're sort of looking down on Mokena, like a big city looking down on just the country farm town that Mokena was at the time. Yeah.
And speaking of that, Mokena at the time, Conrad Schenkel was the one-man police force of Mokena.
Yes, he was indeed.
So do you have any background on that, what the story is there, and how long was he alone as our law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a good question. Conrad Schenkel, or he was sometimes referred to as the village marshal, he was the one-man police force for quite a long time. He was appointed by the village board, In the early 1900s, let's see, I'm kind of searching my mind as to what, I want to say that was roughly around 1905 or thereabouts. He got his post, and then he kept it up all the way through around the end of World War I. He resigned. So it's not like he lost his job over this or anything. He stayed on the scene and was always putting people in the calaboose. So usually people that were causing trouble in the bars and stuff like that.
Wow. So he was, and then was there any point during his time where there was anybody else assisting, or do you know of any deputies or anything like that?
Not that I know of. It was not uncommon on big holidays. I mean, basically by that I mean the 4th of July. When there was like a lot of festivity, a lot of merrymaking, sometimes the village board would appoint 1 or 2 special deputies for the day.
Okay.
But as far as history shows, Conrad Schenkel never really had anybody working under him. It was just him taking care of things around here.
And then would there still have been a Will County deputy as well, in addition to him?
Yeah, yes, they were, but they were not. They don't seem to have been posted here. It doesn't seem to have been quite the situation it was during the 1920s when we had Walter Fisher on the scene, where we had a village constable. In his day was John Frisch, and then Walter Fisher himself was a Will County deputy.
Okay.
Looks like Conrad Schenkel was the only law enforcement in town back then.
And these guys were, well, we assume they're bold enough to send a postcard.
Yeah.
Kind of, again, prodding at the sheriff in the town here.
Yeah.
But in the end, they're sentenced to 100 days in jail.
Yeah.
And do we ever hear anything more of them afterwards that you've seen come up?
No, I haven't. Their names stayed off the pages of our history after that, so we don't know if they just steered clear of Mokena after that. Figured maybe certain people here in town would remember them, or maybe they moved away.
Maybe their time in the calaboose taught them well.
Yeah,
they learned their lesson.
That's right. That's what I like to think.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely. Good. Well, again, another very interesting article.
Thank you.
Neat to see that kind of a piece of this history is still around.
It is,
in Lockport. And where was the calaboose on Front Street?
Oh, good question. So the calaboose was in a few different places here in Mokena when it was still in town. At this time, the calaboose stood exactly where the ESDA building is nowadays, which is just east of Division Street on the north side of the street. Sat right at the base of the water tower at that time.
Great. Well, again, we'll post the link to the article and we'll share the pictures as well that you have in here.
Yeah.
Just be sure, if you're listening, be sure to share this, with your friends. Please like this, follow Matt's blog so you get updated on the new articles as he comes out with those, and then follow our podcast as well so you get updates when the new podcasts come out. So thank you for listening, Matt. It was great to talk to you again, and we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. There's a link in the show notes to Matt's blog article that this episode was based on, so be sure to check that out. If you have any ideas for a show or have any questions we can try to answer, please send us an email at MokenasFrontPorch@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and hopefully answer your question on the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.